I'd like to start our series of short slides on the definition of psychology. Most textbooks define psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes. Behaviors are things that we can actually see, the observable actions of a person or an animal. Mind are things that we cannot see, thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, memories, dreams, motives, and other subjective experiences. Psychology is a science, and as a science it provides us an objective way to answer questions. This objectivity allows me to make a really audacious claim. This will be one of the most important classes you will take at Santa Barbara City College for two reasons. First, because of the centrality of psychology to a liberal arts education, and secondly, because of how useful psychology is to your daily lives. Now, a lot of people, both inside and outside of academics, claim that psychology is just common sense. But if that were true, psychology wouldn't be useful at all. When we look at some of the misconceptions of this science, we can see that the common sense view is simply not correct. Here are just a few of the common sense claims that people have made about psychology. Think about whether or not you think each of these statements is true. 1. Human intuition is remarkably accurate and free from error. 2. We ordinarily use only 10% of our brain. 3. Most psychologists believe that dreams provide a key to the understanding of our inner conflicts. 4. Advertisers can powerfully shape our buying habits through subliminal messages. And 5. About 30% of psychologically disordered people are dangerous. That is, they're more likely than other people to commit a crime. So think about these for a moment. Do you think any of them are true? And if so, which ones? In fact, all 5 of the statements are false. Now, here are a few relatively uncommon claims. As before, think about whether or not you think these claims are true or not. 1. The opinions of 1,500 randomly selected people can provide a very accurate picture of the opinions of an entire nation. 2. Some people can write but are unable to read. 3. People everywhere return favors. 4. On the day we are born, we have most of the brain cells we will ever have. And 5. Personality differences among dogs are as evident and as consistently judged as personality differences among humans. So, what do you think? Are any of these true or not? And which ones? Well, as it turns out, all 5 of these statements are true. If we think about these questions, it should be clear that psychology is not simply common sense. Some of the things common sense tell us might be true are not, and some of the things that we wouldn't have predicted about psychology turn out to be correct. It is this failure of common sense reasoning that helps to make psychology such a fascinating and useful science. Here are a few more true claims about psychology. About half of us will experience a diagnosable mental illness sometime during our lifetime. For men, it will likely be depression or alcoholism or both. For women, the most common illnesses are depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. This is such a reliable finding that I can predict that most of you probably already know somebody who suffers from mental illness. But psychology is not just about mental illness. Most of psychology is about different mental processes and different behaviors. Most of you will fall in love. Some of you are probably already in love. Most of you will struggle with exams. I just hope not my exams. Many of you will get into arguments. You'll have children. You may even have arguments with your children. And nearly all of us will seek happiness and fulfillment throughout our lives. All of these are areas that psychologists have studied and continue to study through research. Given these observations, scientific psychology can help us understand and treat psychological disorders, a topic we will cover in a few weeks. Psychology can help us understand the body and mind and how they work. Psychology can help us cope with stress, help us successfully interact with others, and understand cognitive and learning processes in order to help us get better grades. For nearly all of us, many of these issues are going to be important sometime in the future, if they aren't already. So psychology is more than just common sense, but there remain several philosophical controversies, questions that remain unanswered or are only partially answered. We'll look at a few of these over the next several slides. As you go through the remainder of the course, you will read about questions that psychologists have asked and read about theories that have been proposed to try to explain everything from why some people are aggressive to how zygotes form. Think about these. Don't just read about them and take them at face value. Think about whether a particular theory that is presented is supported by the evidence, or whether a theory or an idea presents a new set of controversies for psychologists to wrestle with. Let's take a look at a few of these. One of the first major questions is about how the mind and body are related. This problem is often referred to under the philosophical heading of dualism. For us, the dualism problem is that the body and the soul, or the mind, are separate but interrelated. This is a huge problem to try to solve. I'm sure that all of you believe that your body is real, that you can touch it, measure it, find out how much it weighs, or how much oxygen it consumes. And I'm sure that all of you think that your mind is real. But you can't define or describe the mind in the same way that you can define or describe your physical body. What is the mind? How can you measure it? How can you touch it? The problem boils down to this. How can something physical affect something that is not physical? And how can something that is not physical influence something that is physical? As we go through this course, we will see that this problem frequently arises whenever we try to draw connections between the brain and the mind, or between the brain and behavior. A second big question in psychology is this: is behavior rational or irrational? We're trying to understand whether our behavior is more influenced by our conscious thinking, or whether our behavior is more influenced by our unconscious mind. This problem is essentially about free will, the conscious control position, and determinism, the unconscious control position. So perhaps the issue is about the relative influence on our behavior of conscious thinking and non-conscious thought processes. I suspect that most of us believe that we are in total conscious control of our behaviors. We decide what to wear in the morning, we decide whether to go to class or the beach, and we decide what movie to go to on the weekend. But as we go through the course, I think that you will find that a lot of our behaviors are influenced by factors out of our conscious awareness. The extreme psychologists on this position were probably Freud and B.F. Skinner, who we will talk about towards the end of the course. Our last major question is often called the nature-nurture dichotomy. This way of thinking leads to questions about the relative contribution of genes and the relative contribution of environments to who we are. Now, it might seem like a reasonable kind of question to ask. It might seem reasonable to try to show that 85% of your blue eyes is a result of genes, and the other 15% is a result of environment. But actually, this way of thinking is flawed. An analogy will help. Think about a chocolate cake. Suppose it takes just 3 things to make the cake: a recipe, your ability to read and follow the recipe, and the ingredients. Does it make any kind of sense to try to say that 50% of the cake is because of the recipe, 35% because you have the ingredients, and the remaining 15% is because you can read and use the recipe? Of course not. This is an absurd question. If you have the recipe and can read it, but don't have the ingredients, you don't have the cake. If you have the ingredients and the recipe, but you can't read the recipe, you don't have the cake. So it takes all three. So nearly everyone working in development no longer thinks in terms of nature-nurture. This view has been largely replaced by what is called the interactionist position. This view argues that the present organism is a result of a constant interaction among genes, environment, and the developing organism. As an example, suppose that you have the genes that contribute to a strong, coordinated body, and that you also practice baseball for 4 or 5 hours a day. Even under the best of these circumstances, you won't be able to play Major League Baseball if you're only 5 years old. Your physical development is not sufficient yet to allow that. Thus, the interactionist position is the better theoretical position to help us understand development, even if it is hard to try to pin down specific genetic, environmental, or developmental factors. As a closing comment, our text uses the term biopsychosocial influences to describe essentially the same idea. Throughout the text, you will see the term biopsychosocial used. When it is, you can be sure the author is pointing to the combined influence of biological, psychological, and social factors on the behavior being described. Try to see that in the theories that we look at and the behaviors that we look at.